Now you think. Because your mommy and your daddy got shot, you know about the ugly side of life, but you don't.
Only a cynical man would call what these people have lives, Wayne. Crime, despair. This is not how man was supposed to live.
People are dying, Alfred. What would you have me do?
Endure, Master Wayne. Take it.
Gotham isn't beyond saving. Give me more time. There are good people here.
They'll hate you for it, but that's the point of Batman.
You are defending a city so corrupt we have infiltrated every level of its infrastructure.
You're Bruce Wayne, the Prince of Gotham. You'd have to go 1,000 miles to meet someone who didn't know your name. So don't come down here with your anger, trying to prove something to yourself. He can be the outcast. He can make the choice that no one else can make. The right choice.
Your compassion is a weakness your enemies will not share.
That's why it's so important.
Your father nearly bankrupted Wayne Enterprises combating poverty. He believed that his example could inspire the wealthy of Gotham to save their city. Did it? In a way.
Gotham needs heroes like you, elected officials, not a man who thinks he is above the law.
Exactly. Who appointed the Batman?
We did. All of us who stood by and let scum take control of our city. When their enemies were at the gates, the Romans would suspend democracy and appoint one man to protect the city. It wasn't considered an honor, it was considered a public service.
Those are Bruce Wayne's guests out there, sir. You have a name to maintain.
I don't care about my name.
It's not just your name, sir. It's your father's name. And it's all that's left of him. Don't destroy it.
We all loved your parents, Bruce. What Chill did is unforgivable.
Then why's your boss letting him go?
In prison, he shared a cell with Carmine Falcone. He learned things, and he will testify in exchange for early parole.
Rachel, this man killed my parents. I cannot let that pass, and I need you to understand that, please.
Okay.
It's happened for years, but last month I must have had the conversation 3 times in a week. Along the lines of Batman, what he means. The big question seemed to be, with a tone so realistic and with a mythos so allegedly grounded, why doesn't he make any sense? What benefit are there to these stories, really, when they follow a privileged, short-sighted man? The capitalist and classist overtones to his stories are pretty hard to ignore. His market saturation, his universe's vilification of the mentally ill, and his ability as Bruce Wayne chiefly to help the root causes of poverty in Gotham using his wealth and means, instead of dressing in a batsuit for some reason, are reasons why this character has often frustrated friends of mine. It actually comes up all the time. All those questions boil down to the same one idea. My friends say that watching Batman properties asks them to think about real issues. But how does Bruce Wayne dressing up in a batsuit actually make any real change?
I'm gonna show the people of Gotham their city doesn't belong to the criminals and the corrupt.
And oftentimes they'll ask me why I've loved the character so much when so much about him and his stories are so openly flawed. It's a good question, but I don't know if any of them really wanted me to actually answer. But I'll do it by telling them what Batman has really meant to me, and I'll start by basically assuring them that they're correct. In most cases, I don't disagree with any of it. I wouldn't say that the vast majority of Batman stories address these ideas adequately at all, but there are many different kinds of Batman tales. Sometimes they don't need to, and it's only been in the past few months where I've really been able to reflect on what role the character has played during my life and what I think it is about his stories that really does make him special, even with, and sometimes because, all this stuff is in tow. And the epicenter of those conversations is usually the first 2 Batman films made by Chris Nolan, possibly because they became such a huge cultural moment for who this character was supposed to be, and created such a worldwide revitalization of Batman that not only affected superhero films going forward, but cinema entirely. You've heard it 1,000 times, but Batman Begins and The Dark Knight rewrote the rulebook on what was possible in this area of cinema. Years later, they still create conversation, light the way for modern films of all stripes, and yet I had the conversation 3 times in a week this year. What made them actually worth thinking about? What makes them such good Batman stories? I'm just talking about the first 2, mind you. Much like most of Chris Nolan's work after 2008, The Dark Knight Rises is pretty and loud and exciting, but it isn't good, so I'm going to ignore it today, as I do most points in my waking life. And the first 2 films are by no means perfect themselves either, I've got no qualms saying that. Batman Begins' last third loses its grip on scope in a pretty outlandish fashion, and the geography of the Narrows within Gotham as a city is really hard to pinpoint throughout. The Dark Knight, like a lot of Nolan's work, has some pretty baffling sound mixing issues. The editing is esoteric and hard to follow at times, particularly on a first time through. I don't think Aaron Eckhart does a bad job as Harvey Dent, but I don't think he was the perfect choice. And I don't care about IMAX camera constraints in 2008. Aspect ratio changes not used for effect in the middle of the movie is distracting and ridiculous. It looks like there's something wrong with the image half the time. So no, these 2 films aren't perfect, and that's not what I would say to my friends anyway. But on a 2020 rewatch, what I've discovered I enjoy and enjoyed about these 2 films is still very valuable, and I think I finally put my finger on what it really was about them underneath the surface that gripped me all those years ago, as well as what Batman has meant to me overall, given what these films started in me.
All these years I wanted to kill him. Now I can't.
Your father would be ashamed of you.
What I reckon really made Nolan's Batman great was the why of everything. How it actually answers these kinds of questions before you even ask. The why of the world, the characters, the decisions, the results, the cause and effect which led eventually to an intimate 3-man standoff with only 1 gun just after 2 ferries didn't blow each other up. There's follow-through and internal consistency. The detail and weight with which these emotional threads are pulled makes everything in the stories matter on multiple levels. So the first thing that I think Nolan's Batman did really, really right was realize with an epiphany of annoying rarity that the journey from parent death to radical crime fighting is not a straight line. You don't bunny hop from one to the other. There's a few years of loss, depression, a lot of anger, a lot of not knowing what you're going to do with your life, and a lot of feeling like what you were supposed to be was stolen from you. There's resentment, there's trauma, there's hatred, and a thirst for revenge. Batman doesn't just appear out of Crime Alley with his heart and his mission fully formed. And Batman Begins goes to great pains to stress that the most important moments of Bruce Wayne's life was not centered on his trauma, it was his response to that pain, and how he eventually learned to make something of his life after moving on. Because it's tempting and therefore common to paint Batman as a grown man-child who never dealt with his loss and is always fighting in the name of his parents' death, trying to stop this and only this kind of event ever happening again. How does he make real change? But this isn't an origin story on its own, it's just a genesis point. It's the first of many moments which tell the larger story of Batman's origin, and the first and best thing Nolan's Begins did was tell the rest of that story. Of a lost young man who, though discontented, wasn't mobilized to help anybody. He didn't have a positive, affirmative response to this. Batman took a while to come together. And at least in the case of Nolan's Batman, Bruce doesn't fight crime in Gotham because it killed his parents. He does it because it's killing what they stood for while they lived, which was improving the city. Killing the chance of each individual in Gotham to lead a good life. Killing the city that they taught him to love. Maybe Bruce experienced a moment of trauma and draws from that pain, but at no point does he feel deluded while he's Batman that he isn't privileged. He knows he has a unique opportunity to make change, to help not only those people on the barrel of the gun that he faced, but those who feel forced to hold the thing at all. It's important to underline here that Batman's major focus in these films is not a supervillain, it's organized crime. It's crime that makes the lives of people in Gotham worse. This involves addressing a corrupt police force and a broken, ineffective justice system which we can assume is discriminatory against those in poverty, further feeding the cycle of crime in the streets of Gotham committed by desperate people like Joe Chill in the first place. It's the mafia and those it leaves destitute. It's a realistic, many-toothed, vice-like bite a lot of people in an intricate system have on the city underneath the surface. It's also important how Batman's antidote to that isn't to be a hero, it's to be a symbol. That's the central disc of these films. More on that in a minute. This also ties into possibly the most popular query that I'm posed. Why Batman? If Bruce Wayne is rich, why doesn't he fund social programs? Why doesn't he use all the money that he spends on his cars and suits and memory cloth to improve the city instead? Or in the Nolan films, Batman spends his money on Batgear in addition to corporate funding because people like his parents already tried that and it made no long-term difference. It's because the city is corrupt, rotting from the inside as well as out. The police force is in on the take. The judges are rigged. The people in power who are trying to do good, like Lucius Fox, Jim Gordon, Rachel Dawes in the district attorney's office, are shut out, bought out, or straight killed when they try to make change. Because those at the top are still standing on a sea of rats which can devour them.
Their murder shocked the wealthy and the powerful into action.
People need dramatic examples to shake them out of apathy, and I can't do that as Bruce Wayne. As a man, I'm flesh and blood. I can be ignored, I can be destroyed, but as a symbol, I can be incorruptible. I can be everlasting.
What symbol?
Something elemental, something terrifying.
He understands that to make the real change he wants to make, the real long-term difference, he has to be more than one person. He has to inspire people who are aware of the issues but disheartened, like Jim Gordon, and make enough of these people believe that they aren't powerless. And he knows he can only do that through symbolic action attributable to anyone and everyone, by being the first punch of resistance that no one else has the safety to throw. To substantiate this, if you ask me, the scene between Bruce, the wealthiest man in Gotham, and Carmine Falcone, the most powerful man in Gotham's organized crime rings, isn't just as important in the creation of Batman in these films as the death of Thomas and Martha Wayne, it's quite possibly the best scene in both films. The power imbalance between these two is ridiculously lopsided. Bruce commands less than nothing, and it drives this point home of how little money actually buys Wayne in this town, of how small and weak a single man, even an emboldened, privileged, wealthy and powerful man, standing in the face of crime can be. You'll never see a Bruce Wayne more powerless, more figured out, and less impressive in any Batman story than he is right here.
Yeah, you got spirit, kid, I'll give you that. More than your own man, anyway. In the joint, Chill told me about the night he killed your parents. He said your father begged for mercy. Begged. Like a dog.
What really made Nolan's Batman great is that it did this. That it took the time to tell this complete story, and didn't suppose that one event was enough to drive Bruce Wayne to become the Batman. Enough to drive him to misunderstand what kind of help his city needed. Batman doesn't try to protect the rich, he tries to re-establish the right of the city to govern itself. And the films created a world which needed him to do that, which pushed him to do that, was willing to show that becoming the Batman was really the safest, most effective, the only option, and created several moments to double down on that idea. A world in which a superhero actually makes some kind of sense, rises to challenge an adversary which couldn't be tackled any other way, and his deep consideration of how to become a symbol strong enough to accomplish the mission he set out to achieve. To show the people of Gotham that their city doesn't belong to the criminals and the corrupt. That is his one goal. Not to stop muggers and save kids, but to make real change. To show people like Jim Gordon, like Rachel Dawes, like ordinary people all over the city, that fighting the good fight in Gotham isn't a waste of time. Because of the expansion on his origin and the layout of his mission, Nolan's Batman is the only popular media version of the character which tells a full enough version of the character to actually have thematic depth in these kinds of areas. where the character's drive and actions is justified in the story, or it comes not from vague trauma, but from journey, from thought, from character development. Only once you know why Batman is the way he is, once you've laid the groundwork, can you really start building on top of that. But so many Batman stories just skip that step and expect the fruits of no labor to grow all the same. To substantiate this idea of a symbolic Batman rather than a hero, let's take a quick look at Batman's no-killing rule. It's a heavily discussed topic, so we'll try to be brief, but here's how I like to look at it. Just like any other foundational aspect of a character, how Batman defines his no-killing rule is important to see within the context of each individual story in which he or it is depicted. This element does not carry anything inherent without a detailed understanding of what drives the conviction in the first place. It gets to have some pretty ugly overtones in some stories where this conviction isn't clarified. This is why talking about it in specific terms within the story is very important. Now, originally Batman's no-killing came from simple content classification, overseen by the now-defunct Comics Code Authority. It stopped any and all comics depicting extreme violence in their stories, extended to television shows or anywhere that children might see their favorite hero. And this didn't just apply to Batman, it applied to the villains as well. Even in the 1990s animated series, nobody actually killed anyone. It simply happened to be that Batman, Bruce Wayne, carried through this vague idea forward after the Comics Code was considered less strict by the 1980s, and violence was more commonplace. As far as I'm aware, the only popular media version of Bruce Wayne is in films and games to even explain why he doesn't kill within the story is the Christian Bale Wayne in Chris Nolan's Batman Begins. I'd be happy to be corrected on that, but as far as I'm aware, this is the only one. And the motivation behind why Batman makes this decision aligns with the specific themes of these two films perfectly. This decision for this Bruce Wayne comes after a moment earlier in the chronology of the film where Rachel Dawes, a Gotham lawyer and a lifelong friend of Wayne's, points out his hypocrisy in carrying a gun, the same weapon to which he attributes his life of sullen discontent. This weapon murdered his parents and destroyed many opportunities, and as he throws it into the Gotham River, it feels like he's genuinely abhorred by his own ignorance of that alignment. So he's decided on the ideal of not using firearms on a personal level wordlessly, but in regard to his not killing in fighting injustice, he does explain this in plain terms.
Your compassion is a weakness your enemies will not share.
That's why it's so important. It separates us from them.
You want to fight criminals? This man is a murderer.
This man should be tried.
By whom? Corrupt bureaucrats? Criminals mock society's laws. You know this better than most.
I will go back to Gotham and I will fight men like this, but I will not become an executioner.
The first and most obvious benefit in this is that it clearly shows Bruce Wayne's dedication to being different from a criminal while he fights criminality, and he thinks that that really lies in not just sparing their lives, but in having a level of compassion for them, something which we've seen in the film he previously hasn't been able to grasp. So this is a moment of growth for him. Having compassion for those who do wrong because they're dealing with their own devils, their own problems, is something subtle here, but it's very important. Right and wrong isn't a simple enough thing for him to act out decisive violence. He knows so little of what's actually happened. The idea of a compassionate Batman is incredibly cool to me. But more importantly, it's easy to take Bruce's refusal here as a Batman doesn't kill rule. Even The Dark Knight Rises, I would say, misunderstands what's said here. But in context, and in keeping with the wording of what Wayne says, he never declares that he won't kill. He says he won't become an executioner. So it's not to do with death, it's to do with judgment. So within these two films, Batman doesn't have a no-killing rule. He has a rule against passing judgment on another person through lethal means. He wants to save Gotham and be an example to people there, which doesn't involve becoming the one and only thing in Gotham that criminals answer to. So he funnels them back into a system, back to the people of Gotham, who maintain the authority to right the wrongs. And if he addresses the corruption in the city as rigorously as the organized crime on the streets, the people will have their say again. Execution doesn't start conversations within the Gotham community to actually address the infrastructure which allows violent crime to continue in the first place, which is where the real solutions are. This is how Batman makes real change in these films. He's trying to help the people of Gotham reclaim their city, to defeat the disease, not just treat the symptoms. That is why this Batman doesn't execute. This means if someone happens to die or is caught in the crossfire, yes, that will happen. At the end of The Dark Knight, he's even willing to allow many murders to be attributed to Batman because it's what needs to happen for his ultimate goal to succeed. but the idea of a symbolic Batman in Gotham is important in a lot of ways. He's on the side of the people, but he also acts as a symbolic deterrent to taking the crime path. He's more mysterious than criminals now because he's exposed them for who they really are. And it doubles down on this first film's main theme. You always fear what you don't understand. And I guess when the film is at its best, it shows Bruce Wayne's willingness to accept the boundaries of what he does and doesn't know, and either learns what's beyond them or stops being afraid of what lies on the other side. In turn, he uses the mystery that aided criminality's power over Gotham's people to his own advantage. That which Bruce didn't understand, namely the kind of situation which drove Joe Chill to murder someone, struck fear into his heart and dictated a lot of how he lived his life after that point without him even realizing it. Fear was driving him, fear that Joe also felt, that his father felt, that everyone in this entire question is feeling on different levels and for different reasons. Bruce just realizes that more acutely than anybody else, and is in a position to do something about it. The parallel of the bats attacking Bruce in the well becomes obvious after that point. They're both scared of each other, and violent reaction is the immediate outcome. Bruce Wayne attacks the bats in return. So Bruce, simply realizing that everyone feels this way in Gotham, uses the fear driving criminality and apathy toward it in the opposite direction. He adds in a surprising amount of compassion in response to that fear, and suddenly we have what Gotham needs. A radical example scaring those who have spent their lives thinking they're the scariest, while at the same time emboldening those who've been under the grip of that unspoken tyranny to actually start living their lives. From there, the rest of the film plays out with the literal idea of weaponized fear, hallucinogenic gas, and the war between having compassion and punishment. Ra's al Ghul, Batman's teacher, believes that absolute judgment enacted without exception is what is necessary to right the world, whereas Batman is clearly on the side of providing space for the ship to right itself, for rehabilitation. Comparatively, it's a far more hopeful approach. And we start to see through these kinds of metaphors where the strength of a comic book film adaptation can really lie in some ways. Archetype and clear thematic work, because the metaphor is not subtle. It's pretty easy to follow, it's not difficult to interpret, but at the same time does require attentiveness to find how it's relevant on a large scale, on the plot scale, to the character motivations. There's two levels to that, and it requires something of a personal stake. And when I was first watching this film, it kind of rocked my world to see there could be multiple layers to the world of a film and character motivations. It's absolutely present in prior superhero work, Ang Lee's Hulk for sure, but there was something about the line that Batman Begins walked between that clarity and its engaging action, music, performances, and tension, which held the door that little bit wider for me. It had this ebb and flow between the thrill and the meaty story which was so enticing, which is seen again, to an even greater extent, in its sequel, The Dark Knight. Alfred explains the idea behind this film pretty eloquently in basically a single scene, finalizing in the film's second most quoted line. Some men just want to watch the world burn.
You crossed the line first, so you squeezed them, you hammered them to the point of desperation. And in their desperation, they turned to a man they didn't fully understand.
Now, it's a popular thing, but The Dark Knight, I think, does a better job of contextualizing how Joker is a natural opposite to the Batman than most Batman stories I've seen, by showing how Joker was an opportunist taking advantage of the desperate situation that someone had led the organized crime rings into. Does that sound familiar at all? Just as how Bruce was the one who had the ability to rise as an extreme response, the Joker is his mirror. He double-crosses and guts the mobs the same way that Batman superseded the police force. He makes a mockery of the police's efforts just like Batman made of the mob. This film displays Joker as an absolute, which gives him that sense of mystery and singularity which Batman's efforts in the previous film had dispelled any other kind of criminal from keeping. It doesn't feel like Batman is afraid of the Joker, but he doesn't understand him. Just like no one can figure out why Batman cares so much about Gotham, there's nothing to understand. It doesn't have a reason, it goes deeper than can be explained. At the end of Batman Begins leading into The Dark Knight, Gotham has crawled from the cesspit and still has work to do, but can't get to the finish line by just following what Batman does, which is fighting back. It needs to believe in moving forward, which is what Harvey Dent, the district attorney, comes to represent. This is all clearly laid out in the film. He's Gotham's hero with a face, the one who might be able to stand on the pile of rats and not get eaten. But given how they're the two forces present in the film, Batman and the Joker have the same goal: to lift up Harvey Dent as a symbol to Gotham and show what their city really is, which they both believe are very different things. And obviously at the end of the day, it ends up being two things. It's burnt and scarred and awful, but also kind and strong and determined. Harvey Dent is Gotham in a way, and so both Batman and the Joker win in their own styles. The Joker proves by destroying Harvey's belief in real change, in changing his outlook from hope to chance and anarchy, that Gotham is a wrathful place. He wins, he's right, that what the city produces in its most desperate states is uncompromising, uncaring, and going to eat itself. And the Joker asks people if they want to know how he got his scars. The only real answer is that he got them from living in Gotham. But Batman also wins, because the people of Gotham were already inspired enough to not follow the Joker. By helping Harvey die a hero, by giving him enough time to do what he needed to do, he did make real change, and shows that Gotham really is capable of overcoming great struggle, capable of great good, and it's worth fighting for. It might be a dubious, doubtful victory in secret, but it's a victory publicly, which is maybe what mattered most. Both symbols and messages of nihilism and of endurance are equally as powerful at such high temperatures, and it's just a story about which one wins within individual circumstances on any given day. And it's wrapped up in some great original action, some really tense stakes, an antagonist as intricate as the protagonist, some great music, truly awesome performances by Heath Ledger, Christian Bale and Michael Caine, and some nuggets of writing which, even after 14 years, are as potent and memorable as they were when first heard. And the cherry on top is that after this, there's an understanding that while the symbol of Batman remains in Gotham, the need for him might not be there anymore. And the story is open but definitely ended. His goal was to prove that Gotham didn't belong to criminals. His goal was to inspire people to take control, and he did it. When they were pushed to their absolute limit, when they had everything to lose, even when they were scared and screaming, they saved themselves. That's not only expounding on what exact kind of real change Batman created in Gotham to a level of detail and emotional weight in a way that's rare, the execution is still singular in this genre of film. What other kind of action movie tells the climax of the story with characters you've never met before and does it in a way that works? It needs two films of work, it needs these thematics, it needs this motion for this to make sense, and it absolutely succeeded. It places the city, its people, the free and the criminal, into the middle of a conflict where they have to decide between two equally argued paths to follow. And it holds a thematic weight of incredible intensity because of its truly central placement within the ideology and the origin of the two main characters of the film. Both films led to this moment. It's simply masterful. Then there's the personal story of Harvey, Bruce, Jim, and Rachel, which had its climactic moment after this. A much better way to end the film in a more intimate moment. But for all intents and purposes, Batman's entire mission, the one he set out to achieve, was completed at this exact moment.
What were you trying to prove? That deep down, everyone's as ugly as you. You're alone.
The duty of serialized media like comics and shows and cinematic universes is perpetuity. To continue forever and find a reason to extend that which is concluded. But by giving Batman an explicit mission, there's somewhere for this to end, and a place for me as an audience member to pick it up. Giving Batman a complete origin and a definitive goal. Definitive rules, definitive steps to get there. The right supporting cast to look at him through, as well as an enduring spirit, is really hard to do. You're trying to adapt a character who is malleable and infinite by design into a space and a story which is deliberately limited, and that has to make sense. There might have been a third entry, but this duo really is a complete story on their own. So what's important to me about the Nolan films is, again, the why of everything. The effort gone to to explain how narrative threads influence each other within individual characters' journey, but also across both films, the world building they employ, and how that world building is as important to the story of the film as the characters are. I tell my friends that the defining element of these films isn't a grimdark tone or an attempt at realism. It's the effort put into explaining why Gotham needed Batman to begin with, and in making sure that Batman feels like a natural and fitting thing in that world. It properly explained not only how he came to be, but also what he was hoping to achieve, why it had to be this way, and the effect he had on those who saw him. And earning that kind of multi-storied narrative design in 2 films is pretty superb. But that's just these 2 movies. Right? There's a lot more going on with Batman in general. One aspect I don't think that Nolan's films ever really nailed is the wider Batman universe's generally unhelpful treatment of mental health. There's an unaddressed assumption in the fiction that there's a correlation between mental illness and violence, which is obviously pretty irresponsible to imply to an audience as wide as a Warner Brothers film might reach. It's a predominant part of his lore, which in this day and age is very much in need of clarification. In a wider way, realizing that, being cognizant of that shortcoming is important. Knowing how to think critically about this, for me, began with Batman, absolutely began with Batman. That's where a film like Todd Phillips' Joker comes in, a film with much less need to include action and tension in these engagement-first choices. It's permitted to step in and deal with this kind of topic more centrally, and excite that conversation further in a more helpful way. And there's a lot of room in the Batman universe to go to those kinds of little places, even if it comes in the form of realizing its shortcomings inside Batman through critical tools. Critical tools that watching a Batman movie may very well have given you in the first place. Maybe Joker or other examples suffer from the same problem of stigmatization, maybe they don't, but that this film was such a visible release, and that it centered around mental health and invisible illness was extremely valuable, simply because audiences were borderline demanded to think about what they were looking at and talked to the people next to them about it, and to react in a way which basically required personal interpretation, and to provide audiences, particularly those in adolescence, the opportunity to engage with more challenging media is really important. So combining it with a property with which they're already familiar can make the process of engaging with it and thinking about it a lot less intimidating. This film was enormously successful, and while it's derivative of many other genre classics, it leads in turn to those classics and acts as a stepping stone for new audiences to begin engaging with the side of media that they may not have encountered before, which is important for creative people and for their critical thinking. You have to start somewhere. You have to be 14 and tired of indifference at some point. Batman is perfect for that. Even if you don't think it was a good movie, Joker started conversations about mental health in a lot of places, and that matters. And it wouldn't have been made without Nolan's films preceding it. Nolan's Batman films started conversations, and that matters. Batman starts conversations, and that matters. That's what Batman's been for me. An accessible property which can give someone a new opportunity to have a real conversation. A moment to think creatively with building blocks, to think about the why inside their own head. So while all these friends of mine have really great points, and while Nolan's films have some answers where other stories don't, the idea that these are the kinds of discussions I still regularly have about these films and this character is why Batman is important to me. I can, fan about Ledger's performance all I want, but we also talk about the thematics and the other deeper genre films to which it led us. We're not just quoting jokes or saying what we liked about it, it actually goes that little bit further. People actually ask me what the character means. It's not perfect, not at all. Batman is a well that runs dry after a time. You do get into some weeds, some weird extrajudicial capitalist overtones when a particular story is less complete, but being able to eventually understand why and where those problems are was like graduation to me. Batman gave me the tools to understand how to talk about what's wrong with Batman. Its archetypal characters, its strong, clear themes, and its centralization of its darker elements before its humor or even its action at important times helped give me a thirst for even more, helped equip me with the solid example of the kind of media I was really searching for, and the vocabulary to start describing it, to that ability to actually pinpoint what I liked about something precisely because it started harder conversations that I needed to be able to navigate. And it's okay to leave Batman behind if you want. Graduate into pure examples of adult storytelling without the action veneer. But I never want to gatekeep that. Everybody has to start somewhere.